I would like you to think back to what this area would have been like 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and you would have had this wonderful hardwood forest, but throughout the forest were lots of openings. Some were just an acre, some might have been 10 or 20 acres long, and these were openings that occurred naturally, and then also that were enhanced by man's activities. The Native Americans would burn them. The settlers, once they were here, would bring their cattle up to the mountains in the summertime, and they would move them, or the cattle would move naturally because they just released them in the late spring, and the cattle would move naturally from opening to opening and graze because grasses would grow up there where the sunlight was coming in. These openings were called sods or balds, depending. I think the Germans called them sods more often, and the Scotch-Irish settlers called them balds more often. Why did the settlers bring them up here? Well, they brought them up here for a couple of reasons. One is the valley floor was a grain producing area, and you had fields and fields of grain, not necessarily fenced in, but open so that it could be harvested. You didn't want your livestock down there ruining the grain product, the corn and the wheat, the rye and the barley and the oats. So you would bring them up here where they were out of the grain production, and it's cooler up here. So the cattle weren't as affected by insects and just the heat. So they were up here for the summer, and then in the fall, the settlers would come up here and gather up their cattle and take them back down the mountain. Now, while they were up here, there were people who would come up here and take care of the animals. They would watch them, make sure bear didn't get in them, give them salt about once a week, and just kind of follow them around. And the animals were on their own, but they had bells on them, and every bell had a distinctive sound, and so you would know whether it's a mile away and you heard the bell, you would know that that's Farmer Jones's old brindle milk cow, and so that happened before the National Forest was here, and it happened after the National Forest. The National Forest folks would rent. You'd pay 50 cents a head, and you keep the cattle up here all summer. And so it happened until the valley went away from the wheat farming, and until farmers were a little more concerned about the breeding practices of their animals. There was no control over what the animals were going to look like after when the babies were born, after they were bred up here indiscriminately in the summertime. So, and plus people started moving into areas along the edges of the National Forest, and they didn't necessarily want cattle wandering through their yard either. So a lot of things that changed as far as agricultural practices and development practices. It just ended that whole grazing mentality, and by that time, once you stopped maintaining those open areas through fire and natural grazing, they closed in and became smaller and smaller. So today you see a much more heavily forested area than you would have seen 100 years ago. We're standing here today at Camp Todd, which was a fairly significant place. In the openings, the sods that were more significant, there were often little structures and camps where people would stay. You might hire somebody to live up here in the summer and take care of your animals, or you might come, if you're a group of boys and men, come up here to get away from the summer heat down there and be a little free. Their mothers would pack them lots of food, and they would stay up here and check on the animals and kind of have a little wild summer adventure. And so a lot of these bigger places had names. There was Camp Todd, there was Clicks Hacking, and a hacking is just an area where you've cut down the trees and opened it up for the sunlight. And if you were a person who lived in the valley floor but on the edges of the mountain, the foothills of the mountains, you would know what these places were and how to get from place to place. There are a lot of memories of folks who came up here as young boys, and just sort of the adventures that they remembered and the things that they didn't like. One gentleman that I interviewed, his name was Mose Karakoff, and he remembers coming up here as a boy, and how they'd eat all their food at once, and then they'd run out of food by the end of the week when they were supposed to be back. Another gentleman remembered in the fall when they took the animals back, and they would gather up animals from half a dozen farms, and when they took them back, they would stop at one particular tavern, to have dinner for the night and keep their cattle overnight there, because it was a long walk home. And the innkeeper's wife would always serve mutton soup, which wasn't so bad except for the fact that he remembered there was always pieces of wool floating in the soup, and it really tasted pretty nasty. But it was a type of cultural activity associated with agriculture that has all but disappeared today. So what you would have had as a result of all this grazing activity that happened up on the mountains, starting in the fall, before the acorns fell off the trees was the rule, because if the cattle consumed the acorns, it would affect their digestive tract and injure them. So before the acorns fell off the trees, you would have the men and the boys from the valley and some professional cattle drovers. They would come up here and they would gather up all these little groups of animals that had been wandering and grazing all summer, and they would gather them up and form great big cattle herds. And they would, if the animal was going to stay over the winter, maybe it was a milk cow or maybe it was a small steer that hadn't really matured to market size, they would drop them off at the farms as they went by. But the bulk of them went to market. And so we think of the great cattle drives as being out west, but the great cattle drives actually started here in the Shenandoah Valley. They would, and this goes back to the colonial period, they would gather up these cattle and then they would drive them down the main roads like the Great Wagon Road, which became the Valley Pike, and they would drive them to markets. And the first market was Philadelphia, so they would drive them all the way down the valley, hundreds of miles, and in the process they would go through all the little towns and villages, Bridgewater, Harrisonburg, Winchester, Stanton, and if you had several hundred cattle coming through every other day, it makes a difference in the status of your little village. There's lots of dust, lots of cattle droppings, lots of noise, and if a dog would get into the cattle and spook them, then you may have your front porches of your houses torn off. That happened more than once, and it's recorded in people's diaries and things. So the great cattle drives went to Philadelphia, they went to Baltimore. Once you had the railroad through, they went to a large railroad head and went there. But still, it was very common, even in the early 20th century, to see in the fall droves of cattle come through, and pigs and sheep too. So and if you went through a toll booth, the Valley Pike became a toll road, then you paid so much per head to pass through, and farmers along the pike would grow corn specifically to feed those animals overnight. This cattle grazing is a long tradition here in the valley. It would have been occurring almost immediately with the first settlement. So the 1720s and 30s, they were grazing cattle up in the mountains and then driving them in the fall to the markets. That continued full force through the 1700s, the 1800s, and probably till the 1920s or 30s, because in a lesser way they would go to railroad heads instead of all the way to Philadelphia or to Baltimore or to Richmond. By the time the Great Depression hit, it was probably ending. It ended fairly abruptly with the Shenandoah National Park being created in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and petered out here in the Alleghenies as development moved into this area, and then you had roads that were being developed through this area with the CCC camps and things like that. But there were still a few families that were doing it until the 1950s.